The evening at the city's most luxurious restaurant was filled with the quiet sound of music, the soft clinking of glasses, and the hushed conversations of wealthy guests. Every waiter and waitress moved with precision, carrying trays like performers on a grand stage, careful not to break the elegance of the atmosphere. Among them worked a young waitress, her uniform neat but simple, her face showing the fatigue of long hours, yet her smile remained gentle as she approached each table. She had learned to serve with grace, blending into the background while making sure every guest felt cared for. That night, however, nothing could have prepared her for the entrance of a powerful man whose reputation was known throughout the city. The billionaire walked in with an air of ownership, his steps heavy, his presence demanding attention. Conversations dimmed for a moment as eyes turned toward him, some admiring, others cautious, but all acknowledging his authority. He sat down at a table by the window, without waiting for the menu, and simply gestured for service. The young waitress, steadying her nerves, approached him respectfully and took his order. Her hands were calm, but her heart beat faster as she sensed his sharp eyes studying her every move. The food arrived quickly, prepared with care by the best chefs, each dish a masterpiece. Yet, when the plates were set before him, he leaned back in his chair with a faint smirk and spoke words that froze the air around them. "Taste it first," he said, his voice firm but casual, as if it were the most natural request in the world. The waitress blinked in confusion, unsure she had heard correctly, but the look in his eyes made it clear he was serious. For a moment she stood still, her tray balanced in her hands, her mind racing between duty and dignity. Never before had she been asked such a thing, and the unfairness of it burned quietly inside her. Yet she could feel the weight of dozens of eyes pressing down on her. The other diners, curious and shocked, had turned to watch the scene unfold, their conversations silenced. Some looked at her with pity, others with discomfort, but no one spoke a word. The billionaire waited, unmoved, tapping his fingers lightly on the table, clearly enjoying the tension he had created. The young waitress swallowed hard, her face warm with embarrassment, but she did not allow her expression to break. She reached for a spoon, her hand steady, though her heart trembled, and dipped it into the dish. In that moment, the restaurant seemed to hold its breath, the soft music fading into the background as the silence grew heavy. She brought the spoon to her lips, tasting the food as instructed, every eye in the room fixed upon her. Though humiliated, she stood with quiet strength, refusing to let her spirit bend. The billionaire leaned forward, watching closely, his smirk widening. But beneath the surface of the quiet drama, something far greater was beginning to take shape, an invisible thread of fate that would soon turn this simple act into a lesson none would ever forget. The spoon in her hand felt heavier than it should, as if it carried not just food, but the weight of every eye staring at her. And for a moment, she wondered if her trembling fingers would betray her strength. The billionaire sat unmoved, his expression calm yet sharp, as if he were watching a performance he himself had designed. While the rest of the dining hall leaned into the silence, waiting for her next move, she lifted the spoon to her lips, her movements careful, though her chest ached with the sting of humiliation, and the taste of the dish, no matter how fine, was lost on her tongue. Around her, whispers began to ripple through the air, hushed voices carrying questions, judgments, and pity. Some guests shook their heads in disapproval, others whispered about arrogance, while a few leaned closer to one another, eager to capture every detail of this strange scene. The young waitress felt her face grow warm, her ears ringing with the sound of those murmurs, but she refused to let her tears fall, choosing instead to stand as tall as she could, her spine straight, her chin lifted ever so slightly. She swallowed the food slowly, forcing herself to keep her hands steady as she set the spoon back down on the table. Though inside, her heart pounded as if trying to escape the cage of her chest. For a brief second, silence fell again, heavy and suffocating, and she could feel her dignity being tested in front of strangers. who would return to their comfortable lives while she was left carrying this memory. Still, she did not allow the room to see her break. Her face was calm, her eyes steady, though beneath that mask of composure, a quiet storm raged, a mixture of anger, shame, and determination. The billionaire leaned back, his smirk unchanged, as though amused by her ability to obey without protest. But there was something else in his eyes now, something curious, a flicker of surprise at the steadiness with which she carried herself, despite the humiliation. The whispers did not stop, and the sound of them burned inside her ears. But instead of shrinking, she gripped the tray in her hands and stood firmly in her place. The dining hall, for all its wealth and elegance, suddenly felt like a stage where her silent struggle was being measured, not by the taste of the food, but by the strength in her silence. She had not chosen this moment, but she would not allow it to strip away the respect she owed herself. Beneath the polished lights and gilded walls, she found a quiet resolve. If he wanted to test her, she would endure it without letting him see her spirit fall. And though no words left her mouth, her silence spoke louder than the whispers, echoing through the hall as an unspoken message of strength, dignity, and resilience that even the billionaire could not easily ignore. A sharp laugh broke the heavy silence of the hall, cutting through the air like a blade, and it came from the billionaire who leaned back in his chair, amused at the scene he had just created. With a casual wave of his hand, he made a mocking remark about the waitress finally being useful for something, his voice carrying just enough that others at nearby tables could hear. Some of the guests chuckled nervously, forcing smiles to hide their discomfort, while others smirked openly, treating the humiliation as entertainment. Yet, not all joined in the laughter. A few shifted uneasily in their seats, glancing at one another with quiet shame, as though they too felt the sting of what she was enduring. The waitress, standing with her tray clutched against her chest, lowered her eyes, her lashes shadowing the sorrow that threatened to spill over. But even in that small movement there was no sign of defeat. Her posture remained straight, her silence carried weight, and though she looked down, it was not in surrender, it was in strength, as if she was gathering herself to withstand the storm. The billionaire's laughter lingered in the air, echoing longer than it should, and for a moment the dining hall felt divided, between those who enjoyed his mockery and those who quietly despised it. Whispers began again, some light-hearted, some uneasy, filling the space like a restless wind, but she stood still, her dignity wrapped around her like invisible armor. Every second stretched, every gaze pressed against her, and yet she refused to crumble. The humiliation was real, her cheeks flushed and her throat tight, but something deeper kept her steady, a sense that her worth was not decided by his words or by the smirks of strangers. She was more than this moment, more than this mockery, and that unshakable truth anchored her when everything else pushed against her. The billionaire's smirk widened, confident in his power, unaware that the same strength he sought to break was slowly revealing itself in her silence. Around the room, a quiet discomfort grew, spreading among the guests who could not escape the thought that perhaps the real test unfolding before them was not hers, but theirs, whether they would stand against cruelty or sit quietly in the comfort of their privilege. The waitress did not lift her head, but her silence began to feel louder than the laughter, a silent defiance that filled the space more powerfully than words ever could. And though she walked away from that table with her eyes lowered, her spirit unbroken, the weight of her endurance left behind a tension no one could ignore, not even the billionaire, who watched her leave with something unsettled in his gaze. The dining hall remained thick with tension, as the waitress stood before the billionaire's table, the echo of his cruel laughter still lingering like an unwelcome shadow. But instead of responding with anger, she quietly reached for the plate she had been made to taste, lifting it with hands that no longer trembled. The room expected her to falter, to show some sign of weakness after such humiliation. Yet her movements were calm, almost graceful, and her face carried no trace of bitterness, only a quiet dignity that seemed to grow stronger with each step she took. Without a word, she placed the dish in front of the billionaire. Her eyes lowered, but her composure steady, and in that silent act she displayed more resilience than any outburst of anger could have ever revealed. The billionaire leaned back, waiting for some reaction he could exploit. But her calm unsettled him in ways he did not expect, because power often thrives on fear and submission, and she gave him neither. The guests, who had been whispering moments earlier, now watched in silence, drawn to the subtle shift in the air, as if the balance of strength in the room had changed. What was supposed to be her humiliation was slowly becoming something else, something harder to define but impossible to ignore. Each movement she made seemed deliberate, her steady hands carrying the weight of patience, her silence speaking volumes, and the more she refused to break, the more uneasy the billionaire became. He had expected tears, anger, or protest something he could dismiss as weakness, but what he saw instead was a quiet courage that reflected back at him like a mirror, exposing the pettiness of his own actions. Around the tables, a few guests lowered their eyes, ashamed to have laughed before, while others studied her closely, realizing that true strength was not always loud or forceful, but could live in stillness and grace. The billionaire shifted in his seat, his confident smirk fading ever so slightly as he picked up his fork, suddenly aware that all eyes were still on them, but for reasons he could not control anymore. The waitress, having done her duty, stepped back without hesitation, her back straight, her expression calm, and though she said nothing, her presence carried a silent message that no one could strip away dignity unless it was willingly surrendered. The silence that followed was heavy, not with shame on her part, but with the growing discomfort of a man who had tried to belittle her and found himself diminished instead. She moved on to her next task, her head held just high enough to show that she was unshaken, and in that simple, quiet strength, she left behind a mark deeper than anger ever could, a mark that made even the most powerful man in the room feel small beneath the weight of his own arrogance. At a corner table, half hidden behind a glass of untouched wine, sat a journalist whose presence was known only to a few. He had come to the restaurant seeking nothing more than a quiet evening. But as he watched the exchange unfold between the billionaire and the waitress, he felt an instinct sharpen inside him. The same instinct that had guided him through years of observing the hidden truths of society. His pen remained still on the notepad, resting beside his plate, but his mind recorded every detail: the arrogance in the billionaire's laughter, the nervous whispers that rippled through the guests, the way shame had briefly painted the waitress's cheeks before vanishing behind her remarkable calm. What struck him most was not the cruelty, for such displays of power he had seen too many times before, but rather the resilience of the young woman, who had chosen composure over rebellion, silence over spectacle, and in doing so had turned the humiliation meant for her into a mirror reflecting the smallness of the man who had tried to dominate her. The journalist leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing, realizing this moment was larger than it seemed. It was not just about one waitress and one customer, but about the fragile line that separates arrogance from dignity, and how easily truth can reveal itself in the smallest of acts. Around the room, he noticed the unease building among the other diners, some averting their gaze in shame, others staring intently, as though waiting for the waitress to crack, but she did not, and that quiet strength held more power than any display of wealth or authority. He thought of the many stories he had written about injustice, about voices silenced and lives overlooked, and he knew instantly that what he witnessed here was not just a personal moment, but a reflection of something universal, the idea that respect cannot be demanded through fear, only earned through humanity. The billionaire shifted in his seat, still forcing a smile. Yet the journalist could sense the cracks forming in his confidence, and the weight of the silence pressed heavier on the man than any words could. In the corner, the journalist slowly lifted his pen and began to write, his notes capturing not only the scene, but the emotions woven through it, the discomfort of the guests, the quiet defiance of the waitress, the fading arrogance of the billionaire. He understood that one day, perhaps soon, this story would reach beyond these walls, not as gossip, but as a reminder that character reveals itself not in the grand gestures of the powerful, but in the steady resilience of the humble. And as he wrote, he realized that he was not simply documenting an evening's drama, but preserving a truth that had the power to shift perspectives and stir hearts far beyond the glittering walls of the restaurant. The dining hall had just begun to settle again, the sound of cutlery clinking lightly against plates, when a sudden cough tore through the air. The billionaire, who had been so smug only moments earlier, gripped his throat and bent forward, his face turning red as panic spread across his features. At first, the other diners froze, their eyes wide, their whispers catching in their throats, but no one moved, fear rooting them in place. Then, in a flash of instinct, the very waitress he had mocked dropped her tray and rushed to his side, her heart racing yet her mind steady as she recognized the signs of choking. Without hesitation, she slipped behind him, wrapping her arms around his torso, and with practiced force, delivered the movements that could dislodge the obstruction. The billionaire struggled, gasping for breath, his arrogance stripped away in a moment of raw vulnerability, and the entire room leaned forward, caught between dread and disbelief. The waitress pressed on, determined, ignoring the weight of every eye upon her, focused only on saving a man who had humiliated her in front of them all. With one final thrust, the lodged piece of food shot free, clattering onto the table as the billionaire collapsed into his chair, coughing, his chest heaving as life and breath returned. A stunned silence followed, heavy and absolute, broken only by the sound of his labored breaths. The guests who had earlier smirked at her pain now stared in awe, their expressions transformed by the realization of what they had just witnessed, not simply an act of skill, but an act of selflessness, of choosing humanity over pride. The billionaire, still trembling, looked up at the young woman, his eyes filled with something new: shame, gratitude, and a dawning awareness that his wealth had bought him everything except dignity in this moment. The waitress, breathing heavily, simply stepped back, smoothing her apron, not seeking applause, not demanding acknowledgement, but standing quietly as though she had done nothing more than her duty. Yet to everyone else, her calm courage spoke volumes, echoing louder than any words could. The journalist in the corner scribbled furiously, knowing this twist would change the meaning of everything he had already written, and the guests exchanged uneasy glances, each of them confronted with the truth that kindness often shines brightest when it comes from the very person who has been wronged. For the billionaire, the realization struck deeper than the near loss of his life. It was the crushing awareness that true strength had stood before him all along, not in his fortune or his status, but in the humility and humanity of a woman he had belittled. In that quiet aftermath, the restaurant no longer felt like a place of luxury and pride, but a place where a simple act of compassion had rewritten the story entirely. The restaurant, once alive with chatter and the faint clinking of glasses, now seemed frozen in time, every eye fixed on the scene that had just unfolded. And in that silence the weight of realization spread like a ripple through water. The same guests who had moments earlier whispered cruel speculations or smirked at the waitress's humiliation now stared with wide eyes, their expressions softened by awe and shame, for they had witnessed not only her skill in saving the billionaire, but her unshakable calm and humility even after all she had endured. She knelt briefly beside him, steadying his glass of water with gentle hands, speaking softly to make sure he was able to breathe without strain, her voice carrying no hint of pride or reproach, only concern. The billionaire, pale and shaken, avoided her gaze, unable to face the truth that his arrogance had nearly cost him more than his dignity. And yet the very person he had treated as beneath him had been the one to preserve his life. Around them, Gratitude began to fill the room in unspoken waves. Diners exchanged glances, heavy with guilt, some bowing their heads as if ashamed of having stayed silent during her earlier embarrassment, others nodding slightly in quiet respect for the strength she had shown. The journalist in the corner lowered his pen for a moment, absorbing the shift in energy, noting how a crowd that once allowed injustice to unfold was now transformed by a single act of compassion, and how, easily, admiration had replaced indifference. Even the restaurant staff, who had stood uncertainly during the mocking laughter, now straightened with newfound pride in their colleague, watching as she calmly folded her hands and stepped back, as though this extraordinary moment was nothing more than routine. Her calm unsettled the guests more than any angry outburst could have, for it revealed a dignity that could not be broken, and it forced each person present to reflect on their own silence when she was being belittled. The billionaire's breathing steadied, but he remained bowed slightly, staring at his untouched plate, and though no words passed between them, the weight of his unspoken gratitude and guilt filled the air. In that heavy silence, the room felt changed, as though invisible walls had shifted and a deeper truth now bound them all together, that respect was not tied to status or wealth, but to humanity, and that humility could disarm arrogance in a way no force could. The waitress, standing quietly with her apron slightly wrinkled and her cheeks flushed from effort, looked nothing like the picture of wealth or power. Yet in that moment she held the respect of every soul in the room, while the man who owned fortunes sat unable to meet her eyes. Stripped of all the armor his status once gave him, the billionaire sat in silence for a long moment, his chest still rising heavily from the scare that had stripped him of all pretense. And in that silence, the weight of his own arrogance pressed on him more painfully than the food had moments ago. He felt the eyes of every diner upon him, not in admiration, as he was accustomed to, but in expectation, waiting to see if he would hide again behind the shield of wealth or step into the uncomfortable truth that now surrounded him. His hands trembled slightly as he pushed his chair back and rose to his feet, and the room seemed to hold its breath as he turned toward the young waitress who stood quietly a few steps away, her hands folded, her expression calm and unreadable. For the first time in years, he struggled to find words, and when his voice finally broke the silence, it carried none of the pride or superiority that had once filled it, but instead a fragile honesty. He admitted, in front of the entire hall, that he had judged her unfairly, that he had treated her as less than human simply because of her role, and that his behavior had been wrong. The words stumbled at first, awkward and heavy, but they were sincere, and the diners leaned closer, their expressions softening as they realized they were witnessing something far rarer than wealth or power, a man unaccustomed to humility choosing to bow before it. The waitress looked at him steadily, her calm presence unmoved by his sudden humility, but her eyes reflected a quiet strength that only made his apology feel more necessary. He admitted that he had mocked her to elevate himself, that he had forgotten the value of respect, and that in doing so, he had shamed not her, but himself. Murmurs spread among the guests, not of ridicule, but of quiet approval, for they knew how difficult it was for a man like him to stand and confess so openly. The billionaire's voice faltered as he thanked her for saving his life, his words heavy with guilt, but also with a gratitude he could not disguise, and as he spoke, his shoulders lowered as though he was finally free of a weight he had carried for far too long. The journalist in the corner scribbled faster than ever, recognizing this moment as the true heart of the story, the transformation of arrogance into humility, the rare sight of a man learning dignity, not from wealth, but from the courage of someone he had scorned. The diners exchanged glances, their respect shifting, no longer directed at the billionaire but at the waitress whose quiet strength had drawn honesty out of a man who had once seemed untouchable. The billionaire lowered his head slightly as he finished, his apology lingering in the hushed air, and though the waitress gave only a small nod in response, the room felt changed, cleansed somehow, by the truth spoken aloud. For the first time in years, the billionaire felt not powerful, but human, and in that humanity lay a new kind of strength. The journalist left the restaurant that night with his mind racing, carrying not just notes on a simple dinner, but the weight of a story he knew the world needed to hear. And as he sat at his desk later, the memory of the young waitress's quiet dignity and the billionaire's unexpected apology poured into his words. He wrote not about money, luxury, or power, but about the fragile moment when pride gave way to humility, and when a simple act of kindness revealed more strength than all the riches in the room. He described the billionaire's arrogance, the humiliation of the waitress, the choking incident that shifted the air, and finally, the apology that silenced the hall, weaving it all into a lesson that touched on respect, compassion, and the true measure of human worth. The article was published the next morning, and it spread faster than he could have imagined, reaching homes, offices, and schools, sparking conversations in coffee shops and online forums alike. People read and reread the account, some shocked by the cruelty of the demand, others moved by the grace of the waitress who never once raised her voice or lowered her values, and many struck by the raw honesty of the billionaire who had chosen to admit his fault in front of strangers. The story became a mirror, reflecting back to readers their own choices in everyday life, how they spoke to a waiter, how they treated a cashier, how they acknowledged those who served them quietly every day. Some confessed it made them pause before raising their voice at a small mistake, while others said it reminded them to show gratitude more freely. The journalist, though experienced in chasing stories of politics and power, realized this simple night in a restaurant had delivered more truth than any headline he had ever written, because it was about something every human could relate to: dignity. The waitress's strength and calm became a symbol of quiet power, her image living in the minds of readers long after the article ended, while the billionaire's apologies stood as proof that even the proudest could change. Schools began to share the article with students, workplaces discussed it in meetings, and strangers online debated the meaning of respect in a world often blinded by status. The journalists never revealed the names of those involved, protecting their privacy, but in doing so, he turned the story into something larger, a timeless reminder that it could be anyone, anywhere, at any moment. And as the article continued to spread, its words echoed the very lesson the waitress had unknowingly taught, that true greatness lies not in demanding obedience, but in offering kindness, not in mocking weakness, but in recognizing strength, and not in wealth or position, but in the simple way we choose to treat others when no one is watching. That night, when the waitress finally returned home, she placed her apron on the chair and sat in silence, her body weary from the long day, but her heart strangely at peace, because she carried with her the memory of what had happened, not as a wound, but as a quiet victory. She thought of the eyes staring at her in the restaurant, the laughter that had cut deep, and then the sudden turn when her hands, steady and selfless, had saved a man who moments earlier had mocked her. She realized she had not only preserved her dignity, but had also left a mark on everyone present, and though she had not spoken much, her actions had told a story louder than any words could. Across town, the billionaire sat in his mansion, surrounded by wealth yet unable to escape the echo of his own apology, the first sincere one he had spoken in years, and he knew the waitress had changed him in ways money never could. He found himself replaying the moment she had rushed to his side without hesitation, remembering the steadiness in her eyes and the grace in her silence, and for the first time, he began to understand that respect was not owed to wealth, but to humanity itself. Days passed, and those who had been in the restaurant carried the story into their own lives, telling friends, family, and colleagues about the night when arrogance bent before humility. And slowly, the lesson spread far beyond the walls of that dining hall. The waitress went back to work, as always, serving with the same quiet patience, not seeking praise or recognition. But now guests looked at her differently, not as someone invisible, but as someone who had revealed the truth none of them could forget. The billionaire, once feared for his sharp tongue and cold demeanor, began to change the way he lived. He greeted staff with kindness, listened to people he once ignored, and made sure never to treat service as servitude again. His peers noticed, and though many wondered about the sudden shift, he never explained in detail, choosing instead to let his actions speak. Yet in his heart, he carried the memory of the young woman who had taught him through humility what no amount of power had ever shown. For the journalist, the story he had written continued to circulate, reaching people who had never stepped foot in that restaurant, sparking conversations about dignity and the small choices that shape the world we live in. And so, without knowing it, the waitress had left behind a legacy reminder that even the smallest acts of grace can ripple outward, touching lives and transforming hearts. Her story was no longer just hers. It belonged to everyone who heard it, a timeless truth that greatness is not found in grand displays of power, but in the quiet strength to remain kind when the world tests you. And that legacy would live on long after the plates were cleared and the night had ended.